If Genghis Khan was the architect of the Mongol Empire, then Ögedei was its master builder. Taking power in 1229, he presided over the empire's golden age of expansion and consolidation. Ögedei's first priority was completing the conquest of the Jin Dynasty in northern China, which his father had left unfinished. This required a fundamental shift in Mongol strategy. The remaining Jin territories were heavily fortified and defended by armies that had learned to adapt to Mongol tactics. The solution was typically Mongol. They adapted faster than their enemies. Working with Chinese engineers and defectors from the Jin, the Mongols developed new siege techniques and incorporated gunpowder weapons into their arsenal. The siege of Kaifeng, the Jin capital, lasted over a year and involved some of the most sophisticated siege warfare of the medieval period. When Kaifeng finally fell in 1233, it marked the end of the Jin dynasty and gave the Mongols control over all of northern China. But Ögedei wasn't finished. He immediately began planning campaigns against the Song dynasty in southern China and authorized the invasion that Europe had been dreading since the Battle of Khalkha River. The European campaign of 1237 to 1242 was like watching a natural disaster unfold in slow motion. Led by Batu Khan, Genghis Khan's grandson, and the brilliant general Subutai, the Mongol invasion force was smaller than many European armies, probably no more than 150,000 men. But they were facing a continent that was politically fragmented and militarily unprepared. The invasion began in Russia, and the pattern established there would repeat across Eastern Europe. Russian princes, despite having witnessed Mongol tactics 20 years earlier, continued to fight using traditional, heavy cavalry charges against an enemy that specialized in mobility and archery. The siege of Moscow fell in 1238. Kiev, the jewel of medieval Russia, was so thoroughly destroyed in 1240 that, according to one account, only 200 houses remained standing. The destruction was so complete that when the papal envoy, Giovanni da Pian del Carpine, passed through Kiev 6 years later, he found only scattered ruins and piles of bones. But the real shock came when the Mongols crossed into Central Europe. Poland and Hungary were wealthier and more militarily sophisticated than Russia, with armies that included the finest heavy cavalry in Europe. Surely they would be able to stop the Mongol advance. The Battle of Mohyj in 1241 shattered these illusions. The Hungarian army was one of the largest and best-equipped forces in medieval Europe, led by King Bela IV, and including heavy cavalry that had never been defeated. The Mongols not only won, but achieved a complete rout, killing an estimated 40,000 to 60,000 Hungarian soldiers. What made these victories so devastating wasn't just the military defeats, it was how effortlessly the Mongols seemed to achieve them. European armies weren't cowardly or incompetent, but their tactics were centuries out of date. Heavy cavalry charges that worked against other European armies were suicide against Mongol mobility and archery. By the end of 1241, the Mongols had reached the gates of Vienna and were raiding into Austria. European resistance had essentially collapsed, and there seemed to be nothing that could stop the Mongol advance. And then, suddenly, it stopped. In December 1241, just as Europe seemed doomed to Mongol conquest, Ögedei Khan died. The news reached the Mongol armies in Hungary in early 1242, and Batu Khan immediately began withdrawing his forces back to Karakorum for the succession Kurultai. This decision probably saved Western Europe from Mongol conquest. The withdrawal wasn't due to military pressure. European resistance had effectively collapsed. It was due to Mongol law and custom that required all princes to participate in choosing the next great Khan. But Ögedei's death revealed fundamental tensions within the empire that would eventually tear it apart. The succession crisis lasted 4 years, with different factions supporting different candidates. During this period, the empire's expansion largely stopped, and regional commanders began acting more independently. When Genghis Khan finally took power in 1246, he faced an empire that was becoming increasingly difficult to govern. The problem wasn't just size, though the empire now stretched from Korea to Hungary, it was diversity. How do you create common institutions for Chinese farmers, Middle Eastern merchants, Russian peasants, and Mongol nomads? Guyuk's reign was brief and troubled. He died in 1248, possibly poisoned, after just 2 years in power. His death triggered another succession crisis, this one even more severe than the last. The winner was Mongol Khan, another of Genghis Khan's grandsons, who took power in 1251 after what amounted to a purge of rival claimants. Mongol was competent, but faced an empire that was showing serious signs of strain. The fundamental problem was that the Mongol Empire had grown beyond the point where traditional nomadic leadership could effectively govern it. Nomadic leadership worked well for tribes and even for military campaigns, but governing settled agricultural populations required different skills and institutions. Mongol attempted to address this by dividing administrative responsibilities among his brothers. Hulagu was given authority over the Middle East and tasked with conquering the remaining Islamic territories. Kublai was assigned to complete the conquest of China. Bok was to govern the Mongol homeland. This seemed like a practical solution, but it actually accelerated the empire's fragmentation. As these regional rulers established their own administrative systems and built relationships with local elites, their loyalty to the central authority began to weaken. The empire was also facing external challenges. The conquest of the Song Dynasty in southern China was proving far more difficult than expected. The Islamic world, while conquered, remained restive and culturally resistant. European kingdoms were beginning to organize more effective defenses. Most importantly, the empire was losing its primary unifying force, the momentum of continuous expansion. Mongol society was built around warfare and conquest, but there were geographical and practical limits to how far expansion could continue. When the expansion slowed, the internal contradictions of governing such a diverse empire became apparent.
The death of Mongol Khan in 1259 marked the beginning of the end for the unified Mongol Empire. His death triggered the most serious succession crisis yet, one that would split the empire into competing factions and ultimately lead to its fragmentation into separate khanates. The crisis centered on two of Mongol's brothers, Kublai Khan, who controlled China and had been conducting the campaign against the Song Dynasty, and Bok, who controlled the Mongol heartland and had the support of many traditional Mongol nobles. This wasn't just a personal rivalry, it represented a fundamental disagreement about what the Mongol Empire should become. Bok represented the traditional nomadic faction that wanted to preserve Mongol customs and maintain the steppes as the empire's center. Kublai represented the faction that believed the empire needed to adapt to governing settled populations and could no longer be ruled from the grasslands. The civil war that followed lasted 4 years and effectively ended centralized control over the empire. Even though Kublai eventually won and declared himself Great Khan in 1264, his authority was never recognized by all parts of the empire. During this period, the various regional khanates began operating as independent entities. The Golden Horde, which controlled Russia and Eastern Europe, was ruled by descendants of Jochi, Genghis Khan's eldest son, and had been semi-autonomous for decades. The Ilkhanate in Persia and the Middle East was ruled by Hulagu and his descendants. The Chagatai Khanate controlled Central Asia. Each of these khanates faced different challenges and developed different solutions. The Golden Horde remained relatively nomadic and maintained traditional Mongol military organization. The Ilkhanate became increasingly Persian in character, adopting Islamic administrative practices and eventually converting to Islam. The Chagatai Khanate struggled with internal divisions between nomadic and settled populations. Meanwhile, Kublai Khan was transforming his portion of the empire into something that was recognizably Chinese. He established the Yuan dynasty, moved the capital to Beijing, and created administrative systems that were far more Chinese than Mongol. This adaptation was necessary for governing China, but it meant that Kublai's realm was becoming less recognizably Mongol. Traditional Mongol nobles saw this as betrayal, while Chinese subjects never fully accepted Mongol rule despite its increasingly Chinese character. The fragmentation wasn't just political, it was cultural and economic as well. The different khanates began developing their own trade networks, diplomatic relationships, and military systems. The Pax Mongolica, which had facilitated trade and communication across Eurasia, began to break down as the khanates pursued different and sometimes conflicting interests. By 1300, the Mongol Empire existed in name only. The various successor states might acknowledge a theoretical Supreme Khan, but in practice, they were independent entities that happened to share a common origin.
Kublai Khan's transformation of the Mongol Empire's eastern portion into the Yuan dynasty represents one of the most successful examples of cultural adaptation in history. But it also illustrates the challenges facing any nomadic people trying to govern a settled civilization. Kublai understood that ruling China required more than military conquest. It required legitimacy in Chinese terms. He couldn't simply impose nomadic governance on a sophisticated agricultural civilization that had been developing complex administrative systems for over 1,000 years. His solution was brilliant but controversial. He would become a Chinese emperor who happened to be Mongol, rather than a Mongol Khan who happened to rule China. He adopted Chinese imperial rituals, established a capital at Khanbalik, modern Beijing, and created governmental institutions that Chinese bureaucrats could understand and operate. The Yuan administrative system was a hybrid that combined Mongol and Chinese elements. Traditional Chinese examination systems were modified to prevent Chinese from monopolizing government positions, but Chinese administrative practices were largely maintained. Mongol law was applied to Mongols, Chinese law to Chinese. This pragmatic approach was remarkably successful. The Yuan dynasty completed the conquest of the Song dynasty in 1279, unifying all of China under foreign rule for the first time in Chinese history. The economy flourished under Mongol rule, aided by the empire's trade networks that connected China to markets across Eurasia. Kublai also sponsored impressive cultural and technological achievements. He patronized Chinese arts and literature while also promoting religious tolerance that allowed Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism, and even Christianity to coexist. The Yuan period saw significant advances in astronomy, mathematics, and medicine. But there were also significant problems. Many traditional Mongols viewed Kublai's sinification as betrayal of Mongol identity. The complex administrative system was expensive to maintain and required a large bureaucracy that created opportunities for corruption. Most importantly, the Yuan dynasty never fully resolved the tension between Mongol minority rule and Chinese majority population.
Kublai's military campaigns also revealed the limits of Mongol adaptability. His attempts to invade Japan in 1274 and 1281 both failed, partly due to storms, but also because Mongol cavalry tactics were less effective in naval warfare and island campaigns. Similar difficulties plagued campaigns in Southeast Asia and Java. These failures were significant because they challenged the myth of Mongol invincibility that had been crucial to maintaining the empire's psychological dominance. If the Mongols could be defeated, then resistance became more attractive to subject populations. By the time of Kublai's death in 1294, the Yuan dynasty was successful but isolated. It had little meaningful contact with the other Mongol successor states, and its Chinese character made it increasingly foreign to traditional Mongol culture.
While Kublai Khan was creating the Yuan dynasty, the other Mongol successor states were facing their own challenges of adaptation and governance. Each developed different solutions based on their geographic location, the populations they governed, and their relationship with Mongol traditions. The Golden Horde, controlling the Russian steppes in Eastern Europe, remained the most traditionally Mongol of the successor states. Led by descendants of Jochi, it maintained a semi-nomadic lifestyle and continued to view conquest and tribute extraction as primary sources of wealth. The Golden Horde's relationship with its Russian subjects was essentially colonial. Russian princes were allowed to maintain their local authority as long as they paid tribute and acknowledged Mongol supremacy. This system, known as the Mongol yoke, lasted for over 200 years and profoundly influenced Russian political development. Interestingly, the Golden Horde eventually converted to Islam in the early 14th century, despite ruling a predominantly Christian population. This conversion was probably motivated by political and economic considerations. Islam was the dominant religion among the merchants and administrators who were crucial to the Horde's functioning. The Ilkhanate in Persia and the Middle East faced different challenges. Hulagu and his successors ruled territories that had been centers of Islamic civilization for centuries. Unlike China, which had been completely conquered, the Islamic world retained strong cultural and religious identity that resisted assimilation. Initially, the Ilkhanate maintained traditional Mongol religious tolerance, but this created political problems. The Muslim majority viewed Mongol rule as illegitimate, while Christian minorities, particularly Nestorian Christians, gained disproportionate influence due to their connections with the Mongol elite. The solution came in 1295 when Ghazan Khan converted to Islam and made it the state religion. This conversion helped legitimize Mongol rule among Muslim subjects, but it also completed the transformation of the Ilkhanate from a Mongol state into a Persian Islamic one. The Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia struggled with the most complex internal divisions. Its territory included both nomadic steppes and settled oasis cities, creating constant tensions between different ways of life and governance. The western part of the Chagatai Khanate, including cities like Samarkand and Bukhara, had been centers of Islamic learning and trade for centuries. These populations expected sophisticated urban governance and had little in common with nomadic traditions. The eastern parts, including much of modern Mongolia and western China, remained primarily nomadic. This division eventually led to the formal split of the Chagatai Khanate in the 14th century. The western portion became increasingly Islamic and sedentary, while the eastern portion maintained more traditional Mongol characteristics. Neither part was particularly stable, and both were eventually absorbed by other powers. What's striking about all these successor states is how quickly they diverged from their common Mongol origins. Within a century of the empire's fragmentation, the Yuan dynasty looked Chinese, the Golden Horde looked like a Turkic Islamic state, the Ilkhanate had become Persian, and the Chagatai Khanate had split along cultural lines. This transformation raises fascinating questions about identity and governance.
Were these states still Mongol if their rulers had adopted local customs, languages, and religions? The answer probably depends on how you define cultural identity, but it's clear that the practical requirements of governing diverse populations ultimately proved stronger than ethnic or tribal loyalty.
The decline of the Mongol successor states was neither sudden nor uniform, but by 1400, most of the empire that Genghis Khan had built was either gone or transformed beyond recognition. Understanding this decline helps us appreciate both the achievements and limitations of nomadic empire building. The Yuan dynasty in China faced perhaps the most predictable challenges. As the Mongol elite became increasingly Sinicized, they lost many of the military and organizational advantages that had made the original conquests possible. Meanwhile, the Chinese population, which had initially accepted Mongol rule as a fact of life, began to develop stronger resistance as Mongol military superiority declined. The Yuan also faced the classic problem of imperial overstretch. Maintaining control over all of China required enormous resources, and expensive military campaigns in Southeast Asia and against Japan had drained the treasury. Natural disasters, including floods and droughts, created additional pressures that the government struggled to address. The end came through a series of popular uprisings that began in the 1350s. The Red Turban Rebellion, led by peasant armies claiming to restore Chinese rule, gradually overwhelmed Mongol forces. The decisive moment came when Zhu Yuanzhang, a former Buddhist monk turned rebel leader, captured Nanjing and declared the Ming Dynasty in 1368. The last Yuan emperor fled back to Mongolia, but even there, Mongol power was fragmenting. The unified Mongol identity that had made the original conquests possible was dissolving into competing tribal factions. The Golden Horde lasted longer, but faced similar pressures. As Russian principalities grew stronger and more unified, particularly under Moscow's leadership, they became increasingly capable of challenging Mongol authority. The decisive shift came in 1480, when Ivan III of Moscow refused to pay tribute and successfully resisted Mongol attempts to enforce submission. The horde also faced internal challenges as competing claimants fought for control, weakening central authority. By 1500, what had once been the mighty Golden Horde had fragmented into several smaller khanates that would eventually be absorbed by the expanding Russian Empire. The Ilkhanate had already collapsed by 1335, torn apart by succession disputes and the difficulty of maintaining Mongol identity while ruling a Persian Islamic population. Its territories were divided among various local rulers and eventually incorporated into other empires. Perhaps most symbolically, even Mongolia itself ceased to be a unified political entity. The homeland of the world's greatest conquerors became a collection of competing tribes, eventually falling under Chinese suzerainty and then becoming a battleground between Chinese and Russian influence. The speed of this decline is remarkable when you consider that at its height, the Mongol Empire had seemed invincible. But the factors that made rapid conquest possible, mobility, adaptability, and unified command, proved less effective for long-term governance of diverse populations.
Despite its eventual fragmentation and decline, the Mongol Empire left an indelible mark on world history that continues to influence our world today. Understanding this legacy helps us appreciate the true significance of what Genghis Khan and his successors accomplished. First, let's talk about the obvious legacy: genetic. Recent DNA studies suggest that approximately 16 million men alive today are direct descendants of Genghis Khan, about 0.5% of the male population of the world. This genetic legacy extends across Asia and into Eastern Europe, a biological testament to the scope of Mongol expansion. But the cultural and political legacies are even more significant. The Mongol Empire facilitated unprecedented cultural exchange across Eurasia. Technologies like gunpowder and printing spread from China to the Middle East and Europe along Mongol trade routes. Islamic astronomical knowledge reached China, while Chinese medical practices influenced Middle Eastern medicine. This cultural exchange was possible because the Mongol approach to governance, which was remarkably tolerant for its time. While the conquests themselves were often brutal, the Mongols generally allowed conquered peoples to maintain their religions, customs, and local governance structures as long as they paid tribute and acknowledged Mongol authority. The Pax Mongolica, the Mongol Peace, created the first truly global trade network. Merchants could travel from Europe to China under the protection of Mongol authority, carrying goods, ideas, and technologies across vast distances. This network laid the groundwork for the later development of global commerce. The Mongol Empire also had profound political legacies. In Russia, centuries of Mongol rule influenced the development of autocratic governance systems that would characterize Russian politics well into the modern era. The centralized, bureaucratic state that the Mongols created in China influenced Chinese imperial administration for centuries. Perhaps most importantly, the Mongol Empire demonstrated that nomadic societies could create sophisticated political and military systems capable of governing settled civilizations. This challenged traditional assumptions about the relationship between civilization and pastoralism that had dominated historical thinking. The Mongols also pioneered several military and administrative innovations that influenced later empires. Their decimal military organization, their intelligence networks, their use of psychological warfare, and their meritocratic promotion systems were all adopted and adapted by successor states. From a broader historical perspective, the Mongol Empire represents the last great nomadic empire in world history. After the Mongols, advances in military technology, particularly gunpowder weapons, shifted the advantage towards settled states with the resources to maintain professional armies and fortifications. The Mongol story also illustrates both the possibilities and limitations of conquest-based empires. The Mongols proved that it was possible to create a world empire through superior military organization and tactics. But they also demonstrated that conquest is easier than governance, and that even the most successful empire faces eventual fragmentation when expansion ends and internal contradictions emerge. In many ways, the Mongol Empire was ahead of its time in creating genuinely multicultural institutions, but it was also limited by the technology and administrative systems available in the 13th century. Modern communications and transportation might have allowed the Mongols to maintain unified control, but with medieval technology, fragmentation was probably inevitable.
As we reach the end of our journey through Mongol history, it's worth reflecting on what this extraordinary empire can teach us about leadership, adaptation, and the dynamics of historical change. The Mongol Empire's rise reminds us that historical outcomes are never inevitable. In 1200, no one could have predicted that nomadic tribes from the Mongolian steppes would soon control the largest land empire in history. The rise of the Mongols shows how individual leadership, institutional innovation, and cultural adaptability can overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. Genghis Khan's story, from outcast orphan to world conqueror, illustrates the power of meritocracy and inclusive leadership. His willingness to promote based on ability rather than birth, to incorporate former enemies into his forces, and to learn from every culture he encountered, created a dynamic, adaptive system that could overcome any challenge. But the Mongol story also illustrates the challenges of sustaining success.
The same qualities that made rapid conquest possible, mobility, adaptability, and unified command, proved less effective for long-term governance. The empire's fragmentation reminds us that building institutions is often harder than winning battles. From our modern perspective, the Mongols were pioneering what we might now call globalization, the integration of distant regions into common economic, political, and cultural systems. Their trade networks, diplomatic practices, and cultural exchanges created the first genuinely global civilization. Today, Mongolia is a peaceful democracy caught between the influences of China and Russia, a far cry from the days when Mongol armies struck terror across 3 continents. But the Mongol legacy lives on, in the genetic heritage of millions of people, in the cultural exchanges that still shape our world, and in the historical memory of what's possible when visionary leadership meets historical opportunity. In an age when we face our own global challenges, perhaps we can learn something from the nomads who prove that no obstacle is too great if you're willing to think differently and act boldly. The next time you hear someone say something is impossible, remember the Mongols. Remember that 800 years ago, a collection of nomadic tribes created an empire that stretched from Korea to Hungary, that facilitated the first global economy, and that changed the course of world history. Sometimes the most extraordinary achievements come from the most unlikely places. And sometimes the key to changing the world is simply refusing to accept that the world can't be changed. Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey through the rise and fall of the Mongol Empire. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history, make sure to subscribe for more epic historical stories. And let me know in the comments what empire or historical period you'd like to explore next. Until next time, remember, history isn't just about the past. It's about understanding the forces that continue to shape our world today.